All right, friends, it's time to give you loyal listeners a discount on protein powder. You may or may not know, but I launched my very first protein powder 2 years ago. It's a grass-fed beef isolate with only 3 ingredients: grass-fed beef, either organic cacao or organic vanilla, and organic monk fruit. Now, if you don't want any of the added flavor and sweeteners, you can also just get unflavored. And no matter what flavor you choose, you're getting over 23 grams of protein per scoop, which is going to keep you full and satisfied between meals. I love starting my day with a Fab4 smoothie and breaking my fast with that much protein. It makes a serious difference in my cravings and blood sugar balance the rest of the day, and I've seen it with my clients as well. Now, I never thought I'd own a product company, but when I got pregnant with Sebastian, I realized the majority of protein powders were chemically extracted or enzymatically extracted, and I wanted to use heat and water only. I wanted minimal ingredients because we don't need those emulsifiers, fillers, or added vitamins, minerals, and probiotics. All of those additions increase the chances that it's not going to work for your body, whether it be bloating, digestion issues. I just wanted pure, clean protein to keep you full and satisfied so you could build the most delicious Fab4 smoothie. And I have to say, I'm pretty proud of the flavor. If you take a look at our reviews on Amazon, you'll see 5-star reviews for flavor. And that is key, because if you don't love your Fab4 smoothie and you don't love drinking your protein powder, you're not going to do it. It won't become a habit, and it's consistency that outpaces everything. So if you're here and you're listening and you want to give our protein powder a try, use the code podcast5 for $5 off your order. And let me know if you love it. My favorite ways to apply this protein powder is in my Fab4 smoothie, making freezer fudge, making chocolate milk, making hot chocolate, and throwing the unflavored into all my kids' baked goods. So let me know how you use it. Let me know if you love it, and share this podcast deal with your friends. Hey, you guys, welcome back to the show. I am so excited to invite my friend and registered dietitian, Sarah Greenfield, to the show. We previously met at NutriBullet. I was training for the LA Marathon with the NutriBullet team and became friends with Sarah in the process. Sarah is a functional medicine dietitian and a poo aficionado. She likes to say that her entire family has struggled with digestive issues, including herself, from Crohn's to SIBO to celiac disease to IBS. And it's become her mission to heal not only her family and herself, but others suffering from digestive issues from the inside out. Today's episode, we are going to talk about the root causes of constipation and gut issues, from acid reflux to bloating to constipation. How and when to use supplements and medication, and if that's the right answer, and how we can incorporate fiber in a way to support digestive health and not block us up even more. So such a pleasure to have you on the show, Sarah. And she is a new mom, and we're just sort of in the same season of life, really just passionate about health. So Sarah, thanks for joining us today, and thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for that awesome introduction.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot to even mention, if you want to follow along with Sarah, her blog is The Fearless Fig, which is super cute little branded site, but definitely has some juicy details. But yeah, let's get going. Let's talk about poop. You had a whole TED talk on poop.
Yeah. It's kind of like, it's become something that I realized was a topic I've been talking about for a really long time. And I was always in the realm of nutrition. And I loved nutrition and I loved connecting with people about their health. And I kept talking about poop. And when I looked back at my life, I realized I'd been talking about poop with my family. I had this little fake poop that I used to carry around with me in college, and I would put it on the floor and be like, and people would be like, oh my God, there's poop on the floor. And I started making these connections. I was like, wow, poop has been this like through line in my life. And I need to just fully embrace it and dive in and say, like, this is what I'm all about. And it's been so incredible to really step into that and just own it and learn about your body through looking at your poop. It's incredible.
It's so interesting. I think that's one of the conversations that I have with clients is, you're doing the health intake, and I'm like, tell me about your bowel movements, and they're flush, bright red, or if it's a male that I'm working with, he's like, oh, they're fine. And I'm like, okay. It's sort of a thing we need to talk about, though, because you have people that eat so healthy and so clean and can be constipated for 2 to 3 days. And
taking double dosing on magnesium or taking laxatives or getting in that cycle of like trying to self-treat because it's something they don't physically want to talk about. So you obviously become passionate about it and have no problem having these TMI conversations. And that's why I'm so excited to have you on today. Because let's get into the nitty-gritty of poop. What should the norm be?
So the norm can be kind of different, but ideally I like to say, as long as you're going at least once a day, it's coming out easily, you're not straining, it's in a nice S shape, you don't see pieces of undigested food in it. Those are all really great signs that things are going well. Also, if it's like not a messy cleanup, that's another one. If it's just making a mess everywhere, toilet paper all over the toilet, like that's also something to consider as well. You want it to be like just pretty easy. Like it should take you relatively the same amount of time to pee as it does to poo. Like you don't need to be in the bathroom for 45 minutes. It's like you're in and out when you have a good, healthy bowel movement.
That's so interesting. And am I going to share this? I'm going to share this. My husband, when he's having his smoothies and he's like eating greens and he's super hydrated and he's taking care of himself and he isn't being bad by Chris, he calls them no wipes. He's like, I could probably get away with no wipe, and I'm like, okay, first of all, well, let's make sure that we're being clean, but it's true, right? It's the ease of expulsion and the cleanliness of expulsion and all of that. So how could someone identify if they're producing S-type poops, or is there some way for someone to look at something online and understand, like, I'm in the healthy range?
Yeah, so there is a great reference that you can Google called the Bristol stool chart. I also have an entire guide on my website where we break down, okay, here's what 7 different types of poop look like. And it's cartoon poop, so it's not like real poop. I'm gonna like show somebody. Like, it's a little jarring to see like real poop. So it's cartoon poop based on the Bristol stool chart. And then just looking at, okay, when your poop looks like this, what does it mean from, dietary perspective, health perspective, and then also what we can learn about it, even if we're looking deeper, like if we do stool testing, microbiome testing, what we can then kind of find out through the different variations of poop.
I love it. So tell me about some of the testing that you do to understand the health of someone's stool.
So I do something called, I do stool testing, functional stool testing. There's 2 that I really like. I like the GI map and GI effects by Genova. Those are both one-day stool samples where it's sampling, your poop. I had one client describe it to me as a wild journey. It's literally like pooping in a French fry container and then dividing it out into little other tubes. And it's an intimate experience with your poop. But again, it's like, it's coming out of you. It's a great tool to understand what's going on internally. So the less resistance we can have to poop and our bodies in general, like the more we're going to learn. So I think it's an important experience to go through a stool test if you haven't before. But those are the 2 that I like to use. And you just get so much interesting data from that.
What's some of the common diagnoses or things that you're seeing on your clients' or patients' result panels?
Yeah. So, I already work with a clientele that comes to me because they have digestive issues. So I see a ton of dysbiosis, and dysbiosis just being an imbalance of our good bacteria to potentially like bad bacteria or pathogenic bacteria, opportunistic bacteria, all this bacteria that we have in there. But when it grows in higher amounts, that's when it starts to become inflammatory. And that can be an issue and, poke little holes in the lining of our intestines, creating leaky gut. It can create bloating. So these are things, that's probably the most common thing I see is dysbiosis. And then that just sets off this whole domino effect of symptoms in people. Like I said, bloating is a big one, rashes, eczema, psoriasis, those things. To me, I personally believe that is starting in the gut. And we can see that when I look at someone's stool test and I'm like, oh, wow, this bacteria is just gone wild. It's all out of balance. Even sometimes there can be an overgrowth of good bacteria that can be creating bloating and actually stealing nutrients, because our gut, our bacteria in our gut, that's the first place that we are actually interacting with the food we eat. So if we have this imbalance of bacteria, then some of those nutrients can be taken by bacteria because it's a living organism. It's not, it's not just there doing nothing. It has an impact on our body.
Absolutely, it does. And there are so many different ways that certain functional MDs and naturopaths deal with dysbiosis, whether it's antifungals, antibacterials, or probiotics and high doses of those. What has been, in your experience and in your practice, what are the ways to healing dysbiosis?
Yeah, it's tricky because you're dealing with, the microbiome, which is shifting and changing. Like what you eat in one meal can impact your microbiome. The way you feel can impact your microbiome. So if you had a stressful day, if you worked out really intensely, it's going to shift and change. So I always take that into consideration when I'm looking at somebody's stool test, because we're getting a snapshot. It's not a definitive black and white, like here's exactly what's happening. This is just, here's an insight. Let's look at what your symptoms are and kind of put this together and make a bigger understanding of what's going on for you. So I always take that into consideration. And I really like to approach things from the idea of how do we restore the microbiome and how do we utilize food and supplements? Because I've worked with a lot of different practitioners. I've seen a lot of different things, and there's different ways of going about it. And I'm not one like, let's just blast the crap out of the microbiome and clear out all of the bad things. That's one philosophy. And I think that can actually cause more problems than solutions. So I really like to look at, okay, what type of phylum do we have? Do we have higher levels of gram-negative bacteria, gram-positive? What are these types of bacteria eating? Because we can go into depth, like bifidobacteria is, eating more of our black polyphenols. Akkermansia likes red polyphenols. So that can start to help shift the balance of the microbiome. So I really like to go into as much depth as possible and say, okay, first, how do we look at what foods can be beneficial here before we just say like, antimicrobials, antibacterials, like blast it out, because it's a delicate system. So that's kind of where I like to approach from, is like, let's look at foods and then let's bring in removals if we need to. If there is really high levels of these inflammatory bacteria, then we have to change it, because now you have this inflamed bodily process and that's just going to throw off everything. So when our body's inflamed, it never ever acts in the way that would like make sense from a clinical perspective. Like when you have an inflamed body, it's just doing things that are like, it doesn't make sense, right?
Definitely.
Like inflammation is chaos in the body.
Absolutely. I love that approach because I think more people are shifting to that holistic approach that you have, which is instead of focusing on wiping out all the bad, which we've seen with antibiotics, you use a high dose antibiotic, you're going to clear out all of the good and bad bacteria. And the guys that survive are a lot of times those inflammatory, aggressive, bad strains that have figured out how to hold on for dear life. And then when that repopulation and regrowth happens, it can be even worse than where we were from the beginning when we started. So it's really interesting. The GI map and the GI effects are both giving you the breakdowns of exactly what's coming out of your body in your stool, where you might be low, where you might be high, and using food as medicine is obviously like my most favorite thing. Let's get into disease states that can happen with dysbiosis and what you're seeing in your practice. Obviously, dysbiosis is one level of bacterial imbalance, but how does bacterial imbalance affect or cause, or how is it correlated to disease states like SIBO, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, diverticulitis? Can we jump into some of the disease states and the nitty-gritty of what exactly those are?
Yeah. So SIBO is a huge one that I work with, just because I think conventionally, the understanding has just started to surface. Like you'll see more GI doctors, especially in LA, that are doing SIBO type testing, breath testing. And to me, when I look at SIBO, it's dysbiosis, but it's just in a new location. So when we're looking at GI map, when we're looking at GI effects, you're looking at dysbiosis in the large intestines. That's what we're measuring. That's what we're testing. But SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, is up in the small intestine. So typically you're assessing that, diagnosing that through a breath test. And that's just dysbiosis in a higher level than it should be, because we have bacteria all throughout our GI tract, from our mouth to our butt. And I haven't figured out a better way to say that. People are like, what's the GI tract? And I'm like, well, it's your mouth to your butt. And I haven't figured out like a cuter way of like mouth to anus. I don't know. It all sounds like a little bit intense, but that's what we're looking at when we see that dysbiosis in a different area, or SIBO. The other diseases you mentioned, diverticulitis, Crohn's, those are inflammatory diseases, and Crohn's is autoimmune. So then we're looking at, okay, well, why is the immune system upregulated and attacking the body in a way that it shouldn't be, right? Like with our autoimmune diseases, that's the whole thing. It's like, why is the body acting in a way that doesn't make sense? And like we talked about already, inflammation, like where is that inflammation coming from? Why is that inflammation happening in the body? And that's kind of where I start to like unpack and look at bigger picture, where it's like, okay, here we have this inflammatory state. We have these inflammatory bacteria. What are we eating to feed that? I also do food sensitivity testing just to create another layer, because it's hard to look when you're doing stool testing. It's one piece of the picture. Like our bodies are not just our gut. Our bodies are a complex system of, everything. So I like to try and bring in as many pieces of data as possible. So looking at, all right, what foods are upregulating your immune system and causing inflammation is another layer that we can then say, okay, cool. Here's the foods that are a problem. Here's the bacteria that is also a problem. And let's start to unpack the puzzle and really figure out what's going to support you. So that's how I go about understanding different disease states stemming from the gut, is just starting to ask that question, which I think we do really well as dietitians and functional practitioners, is not just like, okay, here's the problem, how do I fix it? But here's the problem and why is it there? That's what like is really fun, I think, about the work that we do, is that question of like, why? And then how do we build that healing protocol or just healing from there?
I love that. I think one of the biggest whys, or the biggest questions so many people out there probably listening to this podcast have, especially if they eat clean and, incorporate fiber and they feel like they're hydrated. Why am I constipated? What are some of the major culprits of constipation?
The biggest one that I see from looking at, well, there's a couple. The biggest one I see from looking at a stool test is a bacteria called Methanobrevibacter. And that one is typically associated with methane dominant SIBO and also just slowed down motility and constipation. So there's typically a correlation that we can see just finding that bacteria in the stool test. And then a lot of times people will also say that they're burping a lot when they have that issue. So it's like, putting together the little pieces. But also there's a huge correlation with constipation and emotions. And I worked with a client that was severely constipated, and she said to me once, I'll never forget this because it's so telling of how the body functions. She said to me, I have a really hard time letting go of things emotionally. And I was like, aha, like, let's think about that. Let's think about how you are emotionally responding and how you're feeling and how that's being shown in your body. And when you're holding on to things, when you're clenching, when you're just like so tight that you can't let go, that's happening in your colon as well. Like it's all connected.
Definitely. We see that manifest in all different forms of IBS when it comes to stressful situations and anxiety, and the opposite effect, the experience of fast acting diarrhea and things of that nature based on emotion.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's like, you can go, and I always love to like go deep into the research and be like, okay, what am I not seeing? What's the thing that everyone's overlooking? And so many times it comes back to foundations where it's like, okay, how's your stress managed? How are you sleeping? What are you doing for movement? Are you overdoing any of these things? Are you eating enough? Like those are the simple questions that sometimes do have a really profound impact, where it's like, if you're forgoing all of the basic foundations, there's still some, you got to get back to that too.
What are your parameters, or what are the recommendations you make on those basics for clients to have consistent bowel movements?
So sleep is a really big one that I try to unpack. And usually if somebody is constipated, there is some sort of sleep imbalance. Either they're waking up multiple times throughout the night, or they are having a hard time falling asleep. I see that pretty highly linked. And to me, that's stress, that's adrenal health. So oftentimes I will look at adrenal health and make sure that stress-wise that's managed, and not just from like, oh yeah, I manage my stress really well. Because I think a lot of times we adapt to high stress situations, and then our norm, that bar is raised, and we're like, oh yeah, no, I don't feel that stressed out. But when you look at the body physiologically, it's in this fight or flight, high cortisol response level. But we've just learned to say, no, that's normal for me. And so I think like unpacking that as well is super important to really understand. And like I said, looking at sleep gives you clues into how people are managing their stress. So that's definitely one that I like to kind of take people through, is like understanding sleep. And the Oura Ring is a really cool little biohacking device that I think is really, really helpful, because again, when you're relying on somebody to tell you their symptoms, oftentimes we don't understand what is normal and what is not normal, because we've been dealing with what is not normal for so long that that's our new normal. Like I had a client one time that we did a GI map test and the fecal occult blood was super high, like probably the highest I've ever seen, which means like, that's kind of a scary one, because that can mean like some form of colon cancer, something in the GI tract is bleeding. And I had him go do an endoscopy, a colonoscopy. They found a massive ulcer. And he was like, oh yeah, I do have a lot of acid reflux when I go to bed at night. I never realized that wasn't normal. And I'm just like, oh my God, like just these things that we have kind of like become, accustomed to are not necessarily normal. So it's hard always to rely on people's symptoms. And like, that's why it's like unpacking and asking and like, coming at it from multiple angles is so critical.
Absolutely. What are some other things that you're looking for just quickly on those stool tests that would indicate an ulcer or some type of serious condition?
So there's a couple values on there that I get a little bit like, fecal occult blood is the one, like I said, that can show that there's some sort of tear or something going on in the GI tract. And then also calprotectin. So calprotectin is a conventional lab that GI doctors will often run. We do run that in the GI map, and that can show like just high levels of inflammation and like whether or not, like I'll go back and say, okay, but do you have all of these inflammatory bacteria? So maybe that's causing it, but sometimes it can be underlying like inflammatory bowel disease. So if that's really high, I will most likely have people go do a colonoscopy just to rule it out, because that's another way that I like to utilize functional and conventional together. I think that there's a beautiful overlap between the two, and we can use functional medicine to get a little bit more clear on like what we need to do conventionally to rule out anything problematic or a disease state.
So let's go back to the basics of getting a good bowel movement in. So we talked about sleep and using an Oura Ring, which I love. It's like the only thing that isn't really cumbersome, and it just fits on your finger, sort of like those they look like the rings that people wear to the gym.
Yeah.
The like silicone rubber ones, right? Yeah, those are great. And then obviously getting in a sneak peek at your stool test to make sure there isn't anything standing out that's going to be stopping that type of regular motility. But just the basics outside of sleep. You mentioned not eating enough, hydration, stress levels. So let's go into stress, and then we'll pop into hydration and food, because I think that's obviously the stuff I love. So
yeah. Well, I mean, stress can shift. I always say like stress is not just a way that you feel. It's a whole chain reaction of physiological chemicals. Like, I mean, it's changing your body chemistry. So that's so critical. And when we're stressed out, it like every client that I have has a super high level of stress because they're dealing with digestive issues. And that is, challenging them to think about everything they put in their mouth. Every time they eat, it's potentially causing pain. It's causing regularity. They're not able to socialize because it's like, I don't know if I eat, if I'm going to have diarrhea or not poop for 5 days. So it's really, really stressful. And then a lot of times too, it's like when people are severely constipated, it creates toxic buildup, and now they're breaking out, or they're just, not feeling good. So there's already this high level of stress when people are experiencing digestive issues. So managing it is critical. And I find that like, I'm like, just manage your stress. People are like, yeah, I know. I've read 50 articles on the importance of stress management. So what I try and do is really connect people into, okay, well, why is this important and how does it change? And I love to do that through data. So if we're looking at dysbiosis, and I can explain to someone, the more stressed out you are, the least diverse your gut microbiome is going to be. And that's why we're seeing this imbalance here. Then that starts to connect it, or bringing in data from the Oura Ring, looking at, okay, well, here, you've only gotten into REM sleep for 10 minutes over the past 3 nights. But when you did this meditation, all of a sudden you've extended your REM sleep to 45 minutes or an hour and 15, where ideally we want you to be. So that's where it's like, how do you empower someone to realize that this is important and it's not just like another thing on the to-do list, which I think is really challenging. Is like, people know these things, but they're not implementing them. So it's like, why aren't you implementing them? And getting into that is like, I think a lot of the work that I do too.
Definitely. It's the work of most nutritionists, functional MDs, RDs. Like, if you're really trying to enact change, most of the time your clients and patients coming to you have a lot of information and data, and they know their to-do list. It's acting upon those things. And we want quick fixed results, or we want to see something change, and data can really support people to do that for sure. Let's talk about working out as it relates to stress, because you mentioned working out too much or working out movement. Are you moving enough or too much? Can we unpack that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, living in LA for the past 13 years, training for marathons, that's how you and I met. I love to do intense physical activity. And I see a lot of people that are also kind of in that boat. And it's like, how do you do the most intense exercise in the least amount of time? So like tons of HIIT training, Barry's boot camp, Orange Theory, like really intense, amazing workouts where your heart rate is just like through the roof. Awesome. If your body can handle that, you have to be able to recover and be able to deal with that from a stress perspective. Like, exercise is stress on the body when you're looking at it physiologically. Like, your body doesn't know if you're running on a treadmill or running like from a bear chasing you. So you really have to understand where your body is at and if your body in fact can recover from that. So movement can be good. A lot of times what I find I'm doing is telling people to actually exercise less. And that's like a total mind shift for people, because they're like, but I thought to be healthy, I eat less, exercise more, take out all the processed foods. And I'm like, yeah, these are parts of it. But when we're overdoing it, if our body is in fact in that stressed out state, which oftentimes, again, with digestive issues, it is, then adding on additional really intense exercise actually is hurting the body. So what we see is moderate movement, walking, qigong, tai chi, like all of those really slow, yoga, just something slower is really beneficial to diversifying the microbiome and calming down the nervous system. Like, we have to get into that parasympathetic, which is rest and digest, instead of the sympathetic, which we're all in all the time. Our emails are going off, Instagram is notified. Like, that is the sympathetic nervous system. So really getting into that parasympathetic is critical.
Definitely. So what about food and hydration? Because I love that you're advocating for a little less intense exercise. A lot of times the people who think they can handle it are the ones overdoing it. And calming their body can be a big benefit. And it's kind of against what you said, what most people would recommend. And I also feel like what you just said about eating more is the opposite of what you normally hear. How can quantity affect stools?
Yeah, well, oftentimes what can happen too is when you're eating, well, what I see with people is they're not eating enough, which is putting a strain on the body. And then, or they're doing an extreme diet where they're not getting any fiber. Like, they're like severely on a keto diet where it's like all the fat, and they're like, I can't eat this tomato because it has 25 grams of carbohydrates. And I'm like, no, you're kind of missing it, because we do need to have that bulk. We need that fiber. We need that to be able to move our poop out of our body. So that's so critical. And oftentimes it's like, well, I want to lose weight, or, every time I eat, I'm in pain. So I'm eating less. I'm eating less of these fruits and vegetables because they make me more bloated, or things with fermentable carbohydrates are triggering all of my digestive issues. So then we're narrowing down what we're eating less, and that's putting more stress on the body. So I think that's how I think of it more in the context of like digestive imbalances. It's like, all right, we're not eating enough, more stress. Like, it's all kind of coming back to stress. And then that's not giving us well-formed, good bowel movements either.
What recommendations do you have around fiber? And if someone is on a carnivore or keto style diet and they've or maybe they are following FODMAP's diet or an autoimmune protocol diet, and they've really like pulled the majority of fiber out of their life. It can be overwhelming to bring it back in. How do you have people bring fiber back into their diet and up their fiber intake and up their food quantity to get regular healthy stools?
So I rely a lot on food sensitivity testing. I like something called the mediator response test, the MRT test, because we're looking at the endpoint of immune system or immune function. So like cytokines, histamines, things like that. We're looking at how those are correlating to different foods. And I like to use that. But I also like to think about, okay, how do we bring in foods that are going to be the least offensive, like cooking your foods, maybe not doing raw vegetables for a little bit and trying to find the ones that are least fermentable, because anytime you're on a ketogenic diet or a low FODMAP diet for an extended period of time, or even an elimination diet, the longer you're on that without a real plan or end goal, the more potential harm you're doing to your microbiome because you're not diversifying it, you're not feeding it. And while you might feel good, again, acutely, long term, it's not really the way to go about fixing your gut. So I try and really take a step back and say, okay, what are you having issues with? If there are fermentable carbohydrates in there, how do we start to bring more diversity, things that you might tolerate? Maybe even some fiber supplements like acacia fiber is typically pretty well tolerated. Sun fiber, I think is another form. Sun fiber, I think is another form of acacia, but sun fiber is great. So just getting like psyllium husk seed is another good one that's tolerated. So just like slowly bringing things back in and getting people to be a little bit more confident in their ability to handle things and doing it systematically versus like throwing everything in all at once. And then they're like, oh my God, I don't know what I reacted to. So
Right.
just trying to like simplify it, organize things, and then empower people to trust their bodies a little bit more.
Definitely. When it comes to using your MRT test, what are you specifically looking for and how do you identify when foods work for someone and when they don't?
So the MRT test is pretty straightforward in the way that it shows you the results. It kind of puts things as green, yellow, and red. And so anytime that I'm seeing a yellow reaction from a food or a red reaction, those are things that are upregulating the immune system. And that's what we want to pull back on. So I look at that and I say, okay, here's things that are definitely irritating your body. So instead of doing like a blanket elimination and just saying, we're going to take out all these things, these 35 different foods, and then people are like, oh my God, those are all the things I love. It's showing like, okay, but here's what your body's responding to. So utilizing data and then looking at their gut to be able to say, okay, we're going to take this out. So we're going to decrease the burden on your body. And then we're also going to rebuild and balance and get that microbiome up. So looking at the different bacteria and making sure that we have good polyphenols that are feeding the ones that we need to and removing and eliminating certain ones that are in higher levels. So it's kind of like the balance between food sensitivity and then the microbiome restoration.
Right. With the end goal being that all foods are acceptable to the body without creating a major immune response by rebuilding.
Exactly. And that's exactly what they are. They are a temporary issue right now. Food sensitivities are irritating the body. That doesn't mean that they are forever out of your diet. And I think that's where when people are doing this on their own, they miss the mark because they're like, that food hurts me. I'm never going to eat it again. Or, they do a little mail-in, I won't say any names, but like a mail-in food sensitivity test. And they're like, I got 10, like can't eat blueberries, can't eat cucumbers, I can't eat any of this. And I'm like, okay, well, what are you eating? They're like, well, French fries are fine. Oh God. So I think it's, understanding that the way the body works is it can be rebalanced and you can get things back in there and eliminations are not necessarily forever. Allergies, that's a different story. But when you're looking at food sensitivities or food intolerances, those are things that can be repaired and rebuilt within the body.
Right. Well, outside of looking at the low quantities of specific strains of bacteria in the gut and feeding those the proper foods that would regrow those strains or proliferate those strains, what other things are you doing to rebuild the gut with clients?
So healing the gut lining is one. So after we get the bacteria back in balance, utilizing things that are decreasing inflammation. So, like high quality fish oils, colostrum can be really helpful, slippery elm, aloe. I love all of those things to kind of just bring down inflammation and seal up the gut and make sure that, it's not happening again. And then doing systematic food reintroduction so that people can see how foods are impacting them, doing it one at a time, giving it 3 days so the body can respond. And then people start to say like, oh, wow, I do understand that when I eat that, I get constipated, or when I have that food, I get gassy. So it's again, just reconnecting people to their body. So that's my whole end goal, because I don't want someone to become like dependent on me. I want them to be able to say like, no, I get my body. I look at my poop to assess how I'm feeling, and then I make decisions based on that. And I know like most of the time people, when they start to feel better is when they deviate back into old patterns and habits. And so it's like, we just have to say like, okay, what are you doing now that you weren't doing 3 months ago and you felt really well? And it's like, oh yeah, well, I'm not doing sleep hygiene and I'm eating this food that I shouldn't be eating. So really just, I don't know, that idea of connecting people back to their body and making them empowered is really how I ensure that they're maintaining their gut microbiome and healing it, and that it is long-term and not just like, within this one moment in time that we're working together.
Absolutely. And I think it's totally normal to be a practitioner and to have a client get really excited to do the work, to see the results, and then for real life to happen. And for them to, that excitement to sort of go away and for things to creep back into their diet, and then to sort of experience a version or a lower grade response to kind of like the same symptoms they had in the beginning. And I always think that clients feel like they're a failure or something. I'm like, no, this is just life happens. Like whether you became a new mom or you just got married or you moved houses. And if your life is in upheaval, sometimes it's rebuilding those habits again from the very beginning based on like, where's your new environment? What's going on? Where are your new, the new places that you're buying your groceries, and how are you meal prepping or cooking for your family? And like going back to the basics over and over again. It's the people who can do that in a resilient way without beating themselves up and thinking they're a failure that I think really stand the test of time versus like trying to find another practitioner, a new quick fix, or starting over. Because that takes a lot of energy. It's just like, hey, life changed. I'm going to like try again and make sure I don't go totally off the rails. But every time you do it, I feel like something sticks longer or stays in your routine and becomes foundational, which is awesome.
Yes. Amen. Beautifully put. It's the mindset too, the resiliency, like knowing that health is not linear, nor is anything in life, and that you're going to make progress and you're going to have days where you don't feel well and you're going to bounce back, but your baseline is always changing. And once you have that education or that connection to your body, you're able to step into it and say, okay, what can I do differently with my new set of skills and my new toolbox that I have?
Well, let's talk about some of those little red flags that may come up for people if they've gotten their gut in gear and they're having regular bowel movements, and then all of a sudden 2020 hits, the pandemic hits, they have a kid, whatever the situation may be, and some symptoms start to creep up. What are some of the symptoms that you see with people who have gut issues?
Bloating is probably the biggest one that I see. And that's usually the first indication that something's out of balance. And it's whether that's like a bloating that starts in the beginning of the day, that they wake up with a flat stomach, and by the end of the day, they're totally bloated and uncomfortable. That's a big one. Shifts and changes in bowel movements. Like now they're gone 3 days without pooping. Pain is another one where it's like I'm eating this and it's just not agreeing with me. It hurts. Acid reflux. Those are probably the primary symptoms that I see associated with people when they're like, oh, my digestive health is starting to waver. And now I think also anxiety. I think people are connecting that more with their gut health, or at least saying like, I'm feeling a little bit more anxious and my gut symptoms are a little worse. And that's another big clue and indicator that the gut is out of whack.
Definitely. Well, let's start with bloating. If someone has bloating, they have that flat stomach first thing in the morning, and by the end of the day, they're 3 months pregnant, and they know they could sleep it off. But what are some of the culprits of that?
Stress. Always coming back to stress. And just even like thinking about stress in the context of meal times. And are you like doing 500 things while you're shoving food in your mouth and not really chewing and not being present with your food? Because digestion starts before we even are chewing. Digestion starts when we smell something, when we think about food. We're producing enzymes, we're getting insulin ready to process things. So I think just taking that step back and maybe like, carving out some time to just be present with your food, that can be a huge reason why people start to get bloated. stress is also going to decrease the amount of enzymes our body is making. So that's another negative impact of stress. So yeah, those are kind of where it starts. And then again, when you're stressed out, when you don't have the time, when you are being reactive versus planning a little bit better, and you're like, oh no, it's 1:30 and I haven't eaten lunch, I need something quick. That's typically when we're going to potentially get more bloated as well, because you're not making the best decisions, or you're going for like a bar or something quick. And those things are maybe not broken down as well.
Got it. When someone has read all of the 40 stress articles and they're like, this is just my life right now, Sarah, I can't get through. This is just my life right now. And there's nothing I can do about my stress levels. What can I take, or what can I do to support digestion, or what tools do you recommend to those types of clients?
So, I mean, I'm a huge advocate for supplements in the right way. So understanding what you're utilizing supplements for. So if you are super stressed out, digestive enzymes, broad spectrum enzymes are a great one to incorporate just to take that bloating edge off. And even sometimes I do like to bring in different adaptogens just to kind of calm the adrenals, because when you are super stressed out, you're putting burden on your adrenals to continue to pump out cortisol. So if we can do something to just kind of soothe that back down before it becomes an issue, that's always helpful. Like ashwagandha, I like a supplement called Adrenasoothe. Like those are really helpful in just supporting adrenal health. But again, like it's a bigger conversation, because if you can't manage stress at this point in your life, like there has to be some moment. So I'll have a conversation where it's like, okay, if you want to be healthy, if this is an important priority to you, where can you make time in your day to do something? Like you can't just operate on adrenaline all day long. You have to figure out like, all right, maybe it's every time you close your computer, you're doing 3 deep breaths and just starting to get that foundation set, because anything that you can do is going to be beneficial just to get that body calmed down. So I think the supplements can help, but also like, sometimes you have to have that real conversation and say, you hired me to help you, but you also have to carve out some time and prioritize your health in this way.
It's amazing how many times it's not about the food. And it's not about that like perfect day where you sit down and you go through the day, you go through the health history, you ask the questions, what are the goals? And it's a job, a relationship, or a past trauma, or something that's like really a trigger and getting in the way of their ability to make time for themselves or to prioritize themselves, or whatever the case may be. It's so crazy. Let's talk about the other two you mentioned, acid reflux, and we'll go back into the constipation piece on supplementing for that, because I think there are definitely people listening in that are probably overusing magnesium and laxatives, and I want to know what your approach is to getting people off that. So let's start with acid reflux, because you obviously had a client who didn't even realize he had acid reflux, and that apparently had a bloody ulcer in his stomach. So
that to me is just so wild. So tuning in with your body, very important. But also a lot of times what can happen with acid reflux is that our bodies aren't making enough acid. And so then all of a sudden we overcompensate and make all of this additional acid, and we have acid reflux. With this client in particular, he was drinking a lot. So it's like we had to have the conversation too about, all right, well, going back to foundations, like what things are causing your body to produce more acid? Like, are you drinking coffee on an empty stomach? Are you drinking alcohol? Are you eating before you go to bed? Are you eating fried foods? Like some of those very foundational things that you learn in like as a dietitian 101, you do have to go back to these things sometimes and just say like, okay, let's assess what's going on. Because there it was. Like you shouldn't have a martini before bed if you have an ulcer and are having severe acid reflux. So, analyzing the lifestyle, looking at what's going on there. But sometimes it's giving some HCl support, or, even ox bile is another one that I like to use just to give some additional digestive support, along with, removing the foods that are increasing acid. Getting the body to be a little bit more alkaline can be important as well. Stress is another huge one, where it's like, if you're stressed out, you're going to be in that acidic state a little bit longer. But that's kind of how I would approach acid reflux. Another one that I will say in that context are, how are you managing it? Some people are taking PPIs or Tums or these different over-the-counter medications that are actually having a worse impact long-term. So like I actually just read a study recently that was looking at proton pump inhibitor use, so PPIs and looking at if you were using them for 3 months, 6 months, the longer you used it, the more it damaged your microbiome, kind of similar to an antibiotic. And so I see people that have been on PPIs for like a year plus, or their doctor's like, just go on it and it'll help. And yeah, that's not really getting to the root cause. H. pylori can be another kind of underlying factor that we see in that acid reflux conversation, which is something you can look for on the GI map. So making sure that that microbiome is in balance and just clear of anything that's pathogenic is another important thing for acid reflux.
Absolutely. You mentioned HCl. So hydrochloric acid supplementation and bringing that in. How can someone start to understand if they have low acid and what's if the culprit of their acid reflux is actually low acid versus high acid?
Yeah, there's different little like tests you can do with baking soda where it's like you take some baking soda and then if it makes you burp in a minute or so, that can be an indication that you have low stomach acid. Or I've seen different ways where it's like you take HCl in a small amount and you take it and you wait like 5 minutes and see if you burp or you get a burning sensation. And if you don't, you just keep taking it until you feel the burn. I don't typically like to have people do it until they feel the burn because at that point it's already like kind of high. But sometimes you can actually take the HCl and just dose it and see like, do you actually feel any difference? And if you don't, then maybe your stomach acid is a little bit on the lower end. Symptom-wise, I look at a big thing I see is like people when they say things are sitting heavy in their stomach or they eat meat and it just doesn't feel like it's digesting well. That can be another kind of correlation to low stomach acid.
Definitely.
So those are things I look at. I also, in blood work, there's a lot of clues there. So looking at just, protein status can be an interesting way to see like, is someone's digestion being compromised and is it potentially a stomach acid issue?
Love that. Unpacking it test by test.
Yeah, it's really going through the body systems and understanding like how does it all, because it's about the system in total, not these individual pieces. So the more you can look comprehensively at the body through stool testing, food sensitivity, blood work, like all of these things, hormones, then you're going to get a clearer and clearer picture of where the imbalances actually are.
Definitely. Well, let's close out today talking a little bit about laxatives and overdosing magnesium and how someone might titrate off of those or use them in a safe way and have regular bowel movements. Return to health.
Yeah. Well, yeah, laxatives are tricky and constipation is tricky because it's extremely uncomfortable. And so we want to get that, going and like dealt with as soon as possible. But the issue, as you know, with laxatives is they're habit forming. So anytime we're using more laxatives, we're decreasing our body's natural ability to be able to poop on its own. So really kind of getting off that is critical. I do like magnesium to help people poop initially, but for me, it's again, finding out what does the microbiome look like? Is there that methane dominant bacteria? Is there just a lot of dysbiosis and imbalance? So looking at that and then, foundational things like fiber intake. Are you eating enough soluble fiber to actually pull water into your intestines and have your bowels actively move? Are you eating enough insoluble fiber to have that bulkage in your stool and move it through? Do you have adequate magnesium levels so that your peristalsis can work and things can be from a muscular standpoint actually moved through?
Great tips for everyone listening in. Thank you so much for your time today and for supporting our community. Pooping is such a intimate topic, but there is a lot that goes into it. And obviously with the Human Gut Microbiome Project and everything that's happening there and all of the information coming out and all the probiotics on the market and all the supplements on the market, it can be overwhelming and people try to take it into their own hands. So hopefully this episode helps people get it going.
Yeah, start looking at poop. That's like the one takeaway. It's our marker. It's our internal ability to analyze our bodies, and it's coming out externally on a daily basis. So it really does give us that tool to see inside of ourselves.
I love it. Well, we'll do a link to your poop guide so people can check it out. Where can people follow along and what do you offer to support your communities virtually?
Yeah, so I do a lot on Instagram. So at Fearless Big is my Instagram. I do a lot of different lives. I have different little mini trainings. I have a whole course on digestion as well. So if you're finding that you just want to learn more about what to eat and how to build those foundational blocks that we mentioned, like stress management, blood sugar management, different yoga positions that are good for digestion, that course has it all packed in there. It's a 4-week course. So that's a great place to start. And then I do work with clients one-on-one, which you can find out more on my website, fearlessbig.com.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for your time, Sarah. This was a lot of fun. And I love that people are going to go look up pictures of poop. So good job, sis.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly, so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Be Well by Kelly. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at bewellbykelly.com and follow me on Instagram at bewellbykelly. I would love if you picked up my books, Body Love and Body Love Every Day. They're sold on Amazon and at all major booksellers.